everybody. Today we are going to be looking at the title story in Angela Carter's The Bloody Chamber and Other Stories. I'm creating this video specifically for my own students, but if you've stumbled across it, I hope you find it helpful. It's going to be the first in a series of videos that we do on some of the short stories we've covered in our English module. I'm really excited about this series because Angela Carter's writing is so rich with Gothic imagery and intertextual references and quite complex explorations of gender and power. Each of the prescribed stories that we look at in this course give us the opportunity to look at how Carter reimagines traditional fairy tales and myths, while at the same time engaging with broader social and cultural questions. So we'll cover context, characterization, themes, symbols and motifs, and I'll end off with some examples of close reading of the rich imagery in the story. I've put page references for every quote. They are from the 2006 Vintage Books edition. I'm going to give you a quick recap of the plot just to refresh your memory. So the story follows a naive, unnamed young woman who has just married a much older, wealthy marquis. He whisks her away from Paris to his remote Gothic castle by the sea, and here she befriends a blind piano tuner. Soon after her arrival, she discovers his collection of violent and sadistic pornography, and then they consummate their marriage. Shortly after, the Marquis leaves on a business trip, but before leaving, he gives her the keys to every room in the castle, but forbids her to enter one particular chamber. Of course, curiosity overcomes her, and she unlocks the door, and inside she discovers the mutilated bodies of his previous wives, who've been brutally murdered and displayed like gruesome trophies. Of course, she panics and drops the key, staining it with blood that just won't wash off. So when the Marquis returns, he finds out what she's done and prepares to kill her just as he did his other wives. At the last moment, she's rescued not by a prince or a male hero, but by her brave mother, who rides in and shoots the Marquis in the head. In the end, the narrator and her mother used the Marquis's fortune to do good by turning the castle into a school for the blind. And through her narration, she reflects on her experience with both trauma and newfound independence. She's quite introspective and aware that she has narrowly escaped a deadly fate. Before we dive into our analysis, I want to provide some contextual information for the story, but also for the collection as a whole. I know I always go on about context during lectures. Context, because it's absolutely key in order to understand the themes and messages and symbolism in texts. It gives us a foundation on which we can build our analysis. So first, let's look at the social context. The Bloody Chamber was published in 1979, and this was right at the height of second wave feminism, which was when people were seriously questioning traditional gender roles, the institution of marriage itself, and attitudes about female sexuality and reproductive rights. And Angela Carter, as you know, was a really outspoken feminist. This was also the decade when some really foundational feminist theory was being developed. Specifically, Laura Mulvey developed her theory of the male gaze in her 1975 essay, Visual Pleasure and Narrative Cinema. And she argued that traditional film is structured in a way that represents women as passive objects of visual pleasure for male viewers. That concept isn't just about movies. It's become foundational in feminist theory, and we see it everywhere. We see evidence of this male gaze in this particular story. Also, on a legal front in the UK, the 70s also brought major reforms aimed at gender equality, like the Equal Pay Act of 1970 and the Sex Discrimination Act of 1975. So there were a lot of changes going on at the time this collection was written. In terms of historical context, the Marquis title and the themes in the story allude to a real historical figure, the Marquis de Sade, who was a notorious French nobleman known for his libertine novels. And he spent a lot of time in prison for sex crimes and pornography. It's crucial to understand that Angela Carter was actively engaging with his ideas in her essay, The Sadean Woman, or Sadean as some people pronounce it. This was also published in 1979. So this was going on at the same time she was writing these stories. And in it, she explores the depiction of women in the works by the Marquis de Sade, and she challenges the traditional views of female sexuality. She suggests that sex acts, when they're stripped of any romance or sentimentality, expose power dynamics at play. I know we've discussed in class the very liberal views on sex that the Beat Generation had, that were at the time considered quite taboo. And in the same vein, Carter had ideas that were also considered quite taboo, even by her peers. She argued that women can't achieve true liberation if they deny their own sexual desires and appetites, even those that are deemed transgressive or dark. She believed that women must define their own sexuality entirely on their own terms, free from male ideological control. And that was part of the central message of the Sadean women. The character of the Marquis is also rooted in historical traditions of female submission and systems of patriarchal power and control. So Carter uses historical references like this in conjunction with subversion to challenge centuries of patriarchal narratives and to reinterpret these through a feminist, more modern lens. When you first read it, the story may have sounded very familiar, and that's because The Bloody Chamber is a retelling of Charles Perrault's Bluebeard, the French folktale about a murderous husband and a curious wife. We did it in the first semester. We did the Grimm version, Fitch's Bird. Carter takes these traditional fairy tale motifs, so the forbidden chamber, the key, the rescue, but reimagines them by subverting expectations. She challenges, for example, the idea of passive heroines, and instead she presents female curiosity and knowledge as something that's empowering. All of the stories in this collection are influenced by folktales as well as the oral storytelling tradition, but they're reshaped. She moves away from the moral simplicity of classic fairy tales, and she does this by introducing complexity and irony and sensuality. In other words, she turns these fairy tale elements on their heads. She's basically saying, we're going to use these old molds, but we're going to fill them with very different modern content and a very different message. It's not simply a retelling. Fairy tales are not the only literature that Angela Carter draws on. Many of the stories, including The Bloody Chamber, also draw on 18th to 19th century Gothic traditions with castles, secrets, and psychological terror. Typical Gothic tropes include things like isolation, forbidden spaces, suspense, and moral transgression. The rich imagery that we see in this particular story, which we'll go through in more detail when we look at a few examples of the imagery, it echoes classic Gothic settings from writers like Anne Radcliffe and Bram Stoker. Carter uses the Gothic to explore the psychology of characters and to expose how patriarchal power can be truly monstrous. And finally, there are familiar tropes of postmodern literature that we see in the story, such as fragmentation and intertextuality, and I will also briefly touch on these throughout. We're not going to do a deep dive into characterization, but I do want to talk briefly about the characters themselves, starting with the Marquis. As I mentioned, the character of the Marquis seems to be a nod to the Marquis de Sade, which is actually where the word sadism originates from. The Marquis embodies the Gothic villain archetype. He is wealthy and powerful and predatory. We find out early on in the story that he's also significantly older than the young narrator, and that is a disparity that immediately establishes a power imbalance, which is then reinforced by his physical appearance. She describes him as a big man and says on page 17 that she's not afraid of him, but of his monstrous presence, heavy as if he has been gifted at birth with more specific gravity than the rest of us. The presence that, even when I thought myself most in love with him, always subtly oppressed me. There's something about him, something about his presence that she finds suffocating. He's described as having a thick black beard and a mask of a face. That word mask suggests a hidden, dangerous interior, something beneath the surface that she can't actually see. His eyes are often noted as having a cold, penetrating quality. They're always watching, assessing in a way that makes her uneasy. The narrator says she was disturbed by the absolute absence of light. The Marquis is also enormously wealthy. He's living in a crumbling but opulent seaside castle, which we'll discuss more when we look at the Gothic imagery in the story. His entire lifestyle is built on excess and luxury and debauchery. The narrator herself describes him as a libertine. He views his possessions, including the narrator, as objects to be collected and consumed. She describes him as my purchaser, a connoisseur inspecting horseflesh, which is interesting because that language strips her of her humanity. It's equating her with an animal he's purchasing. He is the owner. He's also described as a gourmand, and she as his familiar treat. Even the use of the possessive pronoun his there tells us she's not just any treat, she belongs to him. All of this speaks to the objectification of the bride. She exists for his pleasure. Now, our narrator is the young bride who is unnamed, which makes her feel both universal, like she could be any woman, and also symbolic. At the beginning of the story, she's somewhat naive, and she often describes herself in innocent terms in ways that hint at her inexperience, such as young girl, frail child, my innocent and confined life, sheltered as my life had been. She sums it up by saying, I was 17 and knew nothing of the world. However, this character really undergoes a huge transformation as she's exposed to her husband's dark, debaucherous world. We see that she's very impressionable. After she finds this collection of sadistic pornography and they consummate the marriage, she confesses there had awoken a certain queasy craving that she describes as a dark, newborn curiosity. This is where we see her sharp transition from innocence to experience. She's describing these intense new sexual desires that have suddenly awoken in her, but they're so unfamiliar that she doesn't even recognize herself anymore. On page 17, she says she feels reborn in unfamiliar shapes. We see a kind of fragmentation of self here, which is a lovely postmodern trope, especially in that paradoxical diction. Think about the term queasy craving. In other words, she's nauseous but hungry for it. Desirous dread is another paradoxical term that she uses. She wants it, but it fills her with terror. These phrases beautifully illustrate the identity crisis she's having, and she sums it up in this internal battle that she's experiencing. She sums it up perfectly on page 19, where she says, I longed for him, and he disgusted me. Despite all this psychological conflict, she's also fundamentally curious. This curiosity is what ultimately pushes her to open the forbidden chamber. Overall, this bride is a wonderful, multifaceted character who has a lovely character arc. Carter presents her as both intensely vulnerable and incredibly resilient, which reflects the core tensions that women face when they're trying to navigate rigid patriarchal spaces. Now, there are many different themes in the Bloody Chamber, but this video would be super long if I had to address all of them, and we've done many of them in class. So we're just going to focus on three main themes: power and control, sexuality and violence, and female agency. Power and control is one of the most obvious themes in the story. As I mentioned before, there is a clear imbalance of power between the young virginal bride and her older, wealthier, sexually deviant husband. He exerts control through money, knowledge, using silence and fear, creating an emotional and physical prison for her. The Marquis deliberately takes his bride to a desolate, secluded castle. The narrator describes the solitude of the place, the fact that it's cut off by the tide from land for half a day. In abusive relationships, isolation is a crucial mechanism of control. He's cutting her off from her familiar world. He's cutting her off from her support network, from her family. He's leaving her entirely dependent on him and vulnerable to his will. Even the way he talks to her illustrates this theme. He frequently reminds her that she's inexperienced and lesser than him. An example of this is when she finds his collection of sadistic pornography and she's shocked. He refers to her as my little nun and baby. Both of those are done in a mocking way. He's not doing it endearingly. He also refers to her as this child. Both the choker and the key are physical representations of this control, and we'll discuss these in a bit more detail later when we talk about symbolism. But I did just want to mention it now, talking about control. The key to the forbidden chamber is not a gesture of trust, as the marquis implies. He's using reverse psychology here. By explicitly forbidding her entry, the marquis is setting a psychological trap for her. In fact, if you remember, when he gives her the keys, he also gives her very specific directions on how to get to the forbidden chamber. He knows that her curiosity will lead her to disobey, thereby providing him with justification for his pre-planned murder. In that way, his control extends to actually making her complicit in orchestrating her own demise. The narrator acknowledges this when she says, I knew I had behaved exactly according to his desires. Had he not bought me so that I should do so, I had been tricked into my own betrayal. I also want to point out here that Carter's use of the word bought is significant. She doesn't say brought me. She says bought me, underscoring again this idea that she is a possession that he owns and controls. I've paired sexuality and violence as a major theme because, frankly, it's impossible to discuss one in this short story without discussing the other. They are so deeply intertwined. There is an intersection or a convergence of the two throughout the Bloody Chamber. Carter is deliberately merging desire and sadism and power to critique traditional fairy tale narratives and patriarchal attitudes. For the Marquis, desire and violence are completely inseparable. His sexuality is defined by his sadism, which means that the act of murder becomes the ultimate expression of his erotic power. His sexual pleasure comes from seeing women vulnerable and in pain and ultimately destroyed. This intersectionality of sexuality and violence is probably most evident in his collection of pornography that the narrator finds. She describes an image of the girl with tears hanging on her cheeks and the knotted tails of the cat. That's in reference to a whip that the girl's about to be lashed with. She refers to his collection as a massacre. That word massacre suggests large-scale brutal violence, far beyond simple erotic imagery. It suggests that the scene in the book is one of slaughter and suffering. And by doing that, Angela Carter aligns the Marquis' sexual desires with death and destruction. This is the material that arouses the Marquis. What's interesting is that the captions and the titles of the pornography that she comes across is actually a foreshadowing of her own fate. The caption of that image of the girl with tears on her cheeks is reproof of curiosity. Reproof is punishment or condemnation. In other words, punishment for being curious. Another title is Immolation of the Wives of the Sultan. That word immolation is loaded with religious, sacrificial, ritualistic connotations. It means ritual sacrifice, very often by fire. That sort of religious imagery ties in with the very next paragraph, in which the Marquis refers to the pornography that she's looking at as his prayer books. This term suggests that this punishment and destruction of women that she's seeing in these illustrations, it's not just his private fantasy. It's a sacred doctrine or creed he lives by. By calling this obscene library prayer books, he reveals that for him, sexual violence has replaced traditional religion. Sadism is his faith. And these images of female torture are his scriptures. Another place we see this intersectionality of violence and sexuality is the consummation of their marriage, which is not gentle. She uses quite strong verbs. She uses diction and imagery associated with violence, such as impaled, and she describes it as a one-sided struggle. She refers to him as the one who had inflicted pain. This was not a sweet, loving experience. You can see from all of this that sexuality and violence are bound together in this story. The entire narrative critiques a form of masculinity where the objectified woman is taken, the objectification of women is taken to a lethal extreme. The Marquis' love is not pure love. Really, it's the desire to own and control and ultimately destroy his sexual property, equating female sexuality with doom. Female agency is in some ways a more subtle theme than the other two, but this is because the narrator is initially quite passive. Her sexual awakening is accompanied by an internal transformation. You could argue that there is some agency in the fact that she makes the decision to marry him in the first place, in spite of the fact that she doesn't actually love him. Early in the story, her mother asks her, "Are you sure you love him?" And she responds, "I'm sure I want to marry him." The fact that she avoids actually answering the question suggests that she doesn't love him, but she's making the choice to marry him anyway. So there is some agency there. But for her, the first major act of agency for her is driven by her inherent curiosity when she disobeys him and opens the forbidden door. That transgression marks her transition into the active subject. She chooses knowledge over ignorance. The more explicit and decisive model of female agency in the story is actually the narrator's mother. She is the warrior mother archetype. The mother is immediately described in terms that dismantle traditional gentle femininity. She's described in ways that we normally associate with male characters. She's a woman with a fierce spirit, a hero. We see how she has outfaced pirates and shot a man-eating tiger. And unlike traditional fairy tales, where a prince comes to the rescue, it's not a man who rescues the bride, it is her mother. Even her arrival on horseback, it says, "One hand on the reins while the other clasped my father's service revolver." It's quite a dramatic, symbolic image. She's prepared for direct conflict. It merges traditionally masculine tools, so the horse and the gun, with maternal instinct and that motherly desire to protect. And the mother's act of shooting the marquis is a sudden, powerful destruction of that ultimate symbol of male power and control. For the narrator, her ultimate act of agency is her refusal to become a permanent victim. By the end of the story, she uses that newfound wealth to convert the castle into that school for the blind. And by doing this, she's transforming what had once been a place of secrets and violence into a place of enlightenment and purpose. Instead of a place of secrets, it's now a place of knowledge. I'm not going to go into too much depth with the symbols and motifs because I don't want to make this video too long and boring, but there are a few that I want to touch on because Carter's narrative is richly layered with symbols and motifs that function as sort of ominous signposts. They foreshadow the plot, but they also deepen the themes and the message. It creates lovely layers of meaning. So the first one I want to talk about is the ruby choker. This was a wedding gift from her husband, and its position around her throat has connotations of a collar, which speaks to ownership and her as a possession of the marquis, or a noose associated with death. She uses a potent simile to describe it like an extraordinarily precious slit throat, foreshadowing her near decapitation. It's interesting to note here that she always uses the word throat in her descriptions of the choker. She never says it's around her neck. This is incredibly effective because it immediately injects a sense of violence and vulnerability into the description. If you think about it, the word neck is quite a neutral term, but instead she chooses a far more visceral word, throat. It's a site of life and death. It's a point of fatal vulnerability because it's a place where arteries can be cut or air supply cut off. The throat is also essential for speech, and the Marquis's power relies on his bride's submission and her silence. So by placing the slit throat imagery there, the narrative subtly suggests that this luxurious object that is symbolic of wealth is more importantly symbolic of ownership and submission and being silenced. It's a constant visual reminder that she is his possession and that her fate is tied to his dark desires. We see this even in the scenes where he's undressing her and where they consummate the marriage, where she is naked but for this choker around her neck. He gets to see that she is his possession. This is her collar. She belongs to him. Next, we have the castle. Now, the castle is described in Gothic terms with gargoyles and dungeons. It's a site of isolation and entrapment. It's a place that's full of secrets. This is not a homey place. The narrator describes it as mysterious and murmurous. It represents not only wealth and power, but also imprisonment. And we're going to look at this imagery a little bit more when we do a closer reading. Then there's the key. Now, as I mentioned, the key is not a symbol of his trust, as the Marquis suggests it is. It represents knowledge and curiosity, and in this case, transgression. It's the key of mysteries, which incidentally is the title of one of the Marquis' books that she sees in his library. It unlocks the dark secret of the Marquis' true nature. In fact, he himself hints at this when she asks if it's the key to his heart, and he replies, the key to my enfer, which you'll have to excuse my pronunciation, but it's a French word for hell. And interestingly, is also the word for a restricted collection of erotic books that are in the National Library of France. Next, we have the Bloody Chamber itself. This is a manifestation of male power and female victimization. It represents the horror of monstrous patriarchy. It is a quintessential Gothic space. It's hidden, it's locked, it's a place of secrets, and as the narrator discovers, it's full of unspeakable horrors like dead wives and blood and torture devices. And obviously the keys and the doors represent knowledge and access to those taboo spaces. When we look at imagery next, we'll look a bit more at the significance of the Bloody Chamber itself. Next, we have the white lilies. Now, flowers are normally considered quite romantic, but lilies are flowers associated with funerals and death. Her room in the castle has been filled with them. The narrator describes them as cobra-headed funeral lilies and undertaker's lilies. Once again, this links love and death. It's also interesting to note on page 11 that she talks about the fact that the lilies are white, which is a color associated with virginity and purity, but she also mentions the pollen powders that stain you. And that creates an image of purity that is corrupted. It mirrors the defilement and the loss of innocence that the Marquis inflicts. And when you combine this with the fact that that central erect column of the arum lily, the spadix, where the pollen is a phallic shape, it just reinforces this image of the lily as something that binds together sexuality and death or danger in a very symbolic way. It's one flower that is both innocence and corruption, love and death. Next, we have the piano. So the narrator is a musician with perfect pitch who takes refuge in her music. And that repeated motif of music and the piano is symbolic of her purity and her innocence. However, it's really important to note that the piano in the castle is out of tune. An untuned piano can't produce harmony. Its notes clash. And that discord reflects the fragmentation of the narrator's identity. This is a lovely postmodern element. As she attempts to reconcile the romantic fantasy of her marriage with the horrifying reality of the Marquis' sadism. Remember that at the beginning of the story, she describes her excitement at getting married. She was moving up in the world. She had this sort of naive outlook about what marriage was going to be like. That was her romantic fantasy. But the reality for her is far different. She realizes that she has married a man who is a sadist, and she is struggling with the fact that she is both aroused and repulsed by him. Like that untuned piano, there is discord within her. One of the reasons I absolutely love Angela Carter is because she's a master of creating effective, very layered imagery. She does a fabulous job of weaving in Gothic aesthetics with unsettling foreshadowing and very symbolic elements that give such immense depth to the narrative. And we're going to look at this imagery by digging deeper into a number of examples from the text and what makes them so effective. From the beginning of the story, Carter creates these little moments of foreshadowing, and we see this from page 1, where the narrator is talking about the wedding dress that the Marquis bought her and the fact that he also bought a dress for her mother. She says there was a dress for her too, black silk. Remember, this is for a wedding, and what do we usually associate black clothes with? Black is usually a color associated with funerals and with mourning. And that works as a lovely moment of foreshadowing because it signals the Marquis's dark intentions for his bride, which will be a future source of grief for the mother. The wedding's not a celebratory event because even if the characters are unaware of it at the time, it marks the beginning of the end for the narrator, which makes it more like a funeral than a wedding. And of course, that's not the only funeral imagery in the story. We also get more funeral imagery with the lilies that I've already mentioned. It's also not the only hint at what's still to come. She talks about the fact that her engagement ring is a fire opal, and her old nurse says opals are bad luck. She realizes that there's something not quite right. Carter also uses intertextuality as a means of foreshadowing. Intertextuality is another lovely postmodern trope. For example, the titles of the books and the paintings, such as The Secret of Pandora's Box. Obviously, this is in reference to the Greek myth. Moreau's Sacrificial Victim, which is a slight variation of the real painting, which is just titled Victim, by Gustave Moreau. And she mentions The Foolish Virgins by Ensor. Here, she's actually mixing intertextual references. Ensor was a real artist, although he didn't have any artwork by that name. There are, however, multiple paintings titled The Foolish Virgin. One of the most well-known ones is about James Tissot from around 1894. But what that is actually a biblical allusion. It's referencing the parable of the wise and foolish virgin. Many of these intertextual references, including the ones I've mentioned here, hint at the dark plans that the Marquis has for his bride. These titles are all very ominous. It's not just the foreshadowing that creates this ominous feeling. There's also some fabulous Gothic imagery that she uses in the setting, which adds to this. The narrator describes the fairy solitude of the place, with turrets of misty blue, its courtyard, its spiked gate, his castle that lay on the very bosom of the sea. The word solitude speaks to the isolation of the castle. She talks about the fact that when the tide is high, it's cut off from the mainland altogether. It becomes an inaccessible island. The castle's also described as a murmurous castle, a mysterious amphibious place. That term amphibious conjures up images of things like frogs or salamanders, something that's damp and cold and slimy and alive, which deepens the uncanny, almost organic quality of the castle, as if the castle is a character itself. Amphibious describes creatures that exist in both land and water, which is a fitting description of the Marquis's castle because it sits right where the sea meets the shore. And this imagery evokes a typical Gothic threshold or an in-between state, what we refer to as liminality, which reflects the story's obsession with boundaries, the boundary between innocence and experience, between life and death, between purity and corruption. She also mentions gargoyles and dungeons in the castle. All of these descriptions are quintessentially Gothic because they create this atmosphere of isolation and decay and mystery. It creates a sense of impending doom. Even her description of the tumultuous Atlantic feeds into this Gothic imagery. When she first arrives, she says, "I smelled the amniotic salinity of the ocean." She's talking about the salty smell of the ocean, but the use of the word amniotic is very interesting because, of course, it has connotations of being in a womb, an enclosed space. Now, in pregnancy, amniotic fluid protects. But here, Carter inverts that. The sea doesn't protect, it traps. And like a baby in the womb, the bride is innocent and vulnerable, somewhat helpless. This birth imagery also fits with the idea of a new start, but also hints at themes of rebirth and transformation. And that's what we see as the story progresses, as the bride moves from a place of innocence to a place of experience. There's also quite a lot of imagery that ties in well with Laura Mulvey's male gaze theory. As I mentioned when I was discussing the context, the male gaze is the representation of women in art and literature from a masculine perspective that presents women as sexual objects for the pleasure of the male viewer. And the imagery of the mirrors in the castle bedroom is a direct reflection of the male gaze. She describes how the room is surrounded by so many mirrors and says the young bride who had become that multitude of girls. By surrounding the room with mirrors, it turns her into a constant, repeated spectacle as he strips her naked. The mirror ensures that the Marquis can see her, every inch of her, every angle of her. She's entirely exposed to him, and she's forced to see herself as well, her naked body that is perpetually framed and defined by his desire. She's just an object for visual consumption. When the Marquis looks at her repeated image in the mirror, he says, "See, I have acquired a whole harem for myself." Harem is, of course, referring to multiple wives or multiple sexual partners, which just highlights this objectification and the fact that it's all about him and his desires. We also see evidence of the male gaze in the outfits and the jewelry that he buys her, and the Marquis's entire aesthetic project, from the opals and the rubies to the silk dresses, is to dress and undress her for his visual pleasure. If you recall, we saw similar imagery in the first semester when we did Christina Rossetti's poem In an Artist's Studio, where the model was stripped of her own identity. She is reduced to an object, a work of art. And just like that model, the narrator here is only valuable insofar as she satisfies his visual appetite. This is in complete contrast to the blind piano tuner who she ends up with. Obviously, being blind, he's unable to objectify her in the same way. I want to end off by talking about the imagery in the bloody chamber itself. This is where she finds the nude and mutilated bodies of his former wives. These bodies, which are covered in blood and ritualistic wounds, they're arranged as gruesome artwork. They are the ultimate horrifying conclusion of the male gaze. Women that have been turned into permanent, static, violated objects for the eternal satisfaction of the viewer, the Marquis. This is the ultimate expression of the male gaze from which there is no escape. Another interesting thing to note on this point is that when he's giving her the keys and telling her not to go to the forbidden room, he tells her it's just a private study. And he says on page 19, he goes there to savor the rare pleasure of imagining myself wifeless. The word savor is not a neutral verb. It means to taste and appreciate or enjoy something thoroughly, usually over a period of time. And by using it, the Marquis reveals that his enjoyment of the chamber is a conscious, sensual, prolonged psychological experience. He doesn't just go to the room. He goes to savor the memory. The chamber is his private gallery. Those bloodied and dead bodies are his artwork. They're designed for his exclusive, lingering appreciation. This behavior actually feels almost serial killer-like. If you've ever watched any documentaries or shows about serial killers, you'll know that they very often return to the scene of their crimes or compulsively collect souvenirs or trophies to re-experience the moment of absolute control and dominance as they kill their victim. And the Marquis's chamber is his trophy room. The entire room is arranged for his visual gaze of triumph. That's all for the bloody chamber. I hope this video has been helpful in unpacking some of the many layers of Carter's story. I'll be doing more stories in Carter's collection as well as other prescribed literature from the courses I teach. So please subscribe if you want to see when I've uploaded the next one. And please feel free to share your thoughts in the comments.